As way of a little extra treat, at the end of each section or each game, where possible, I'm going to put in a small section with words from the developers and why they created it. Everybody likes a new series, and today we've got a new one for you called Hidden Gem Hunters, where essentially I go through some of the new games to try and find some hidden gems. Let's be honest, the Eshop is not a great place to find anything, so hopefully this format enables us to find some, but also to root out which ones you should avoid. And let me tell you, there are a lot of those. If you do buy any games, save 10% using code SWITCHUP over at switchup.gg, and a big thanks to all of you. We're going to look at Hazel Sky, a really interesting third-person adventure, Ocean's Heart, which caught my eye a while back, but I think we were really busy, a top-down Zelda-like, and finally Blackguards 2, which combines RPG and TRPG gameplay with a strong emphasis on storyline. Are any of these games hidden gems? Well, let's find out. Okay, let's start with Blackguards 2 then. Now, it's a turn-based strategy RPG, and while the first game had its issues, one thing it did really well was brilliant dialogue. And that's definitely the case here. It has some incredible voice acting.
I'm only the watchdog, darling, and this dog doesn't give a shit about the why.
And it's split between the narrative and this hexagonal-based turn-based strategy. Now, in the first game, you could also create your own character, but this time round, to improve the overall story, you'll play as Hazaaaah, who is a member of royalty, essentially, who gets thrown into prison right at the beginning of the game. She's in this grim, dank dungeon below an arena, being tormented by spiders and gradually becoming envenomed and a shadow of her former self, but as you'd expect, she eventually finds her way out. Now, when she does this, the format of the game changes slightly. Initially, you're introduced to the hexagonal-based grid system, and I wasn't overly enthused. Now, it's turn-based, so you have the areas where you can reach, it shows where you can go to and still make attacks, or where you can push to at its full extent. What I didn't like was it can be quite slow-paced, and that's in comparison to the first game, which was even slower. It could just feel a little bit sluggish, especially when you've killed all the enemies, and you're just moving towards a switch. In those moments, I think it would have been better just to go real-time. They do use it, as there'll be things like spikes that come up out of the ground and you have to time your movements, but again, you could easily have done that in real time. The combat uses a radial menu system, which allows you to switch between different loadouts. I did enjoy that. It means that as you find new weapons and apparel, you can set up your troops with up to 3 different ones, so you might go ranged or switch to close range, and it's a big step up as far as strategy goes compared to the first. As Hazaaaah, you'll go around essentially building up an army to take the throne, and can control up to 20 different troops at a time. There's non-linearity here, so there's not a specific route that you have to take to do that. And I do like me a good TRPG. This one doesn't get the full hidden gem for me, it gets a flawed gem, and here's why. Well, a few reasons. Firstly, the pacing isn't right. Speeding up enemies, in my opinion, is almost a must-have. It makes what could otherwise be quite exciting battles feel very slow-paced. While I haven't experienced any crashes, there have been a couple of smaller bugs. One of the trickiest things to get right in these types of games is balancing. Now, whether for or against the player, the balancing sometimes isn't correct. You might have a numerical advantage on paper and get decimated when enemies respawn, seemingly making it a little unfair and makes it unable for you to plan properly. At other times it's absolutely fine, but having that area not quite right did cause me the occasional bits of frustration. Now, all that aside, Blackguards 2 still offers a very meaty TRPG experience, and if you're a fan of that genre and you like RPGs in general, the way that you can steer your character progression in any number of areas makes for a satisfying game, warts and all. And its default price of just £12.99 makes it much more enticing. So a flawed gem, but for £12.99, not too bad. And if you get it on sale, then you're really laughing. Here are a few interesting thoughts from the game's developer, Kai Feibig, over at Daedalic Entertainment. Now, as we know, Daedalic Entertainment are known for their adventure games, so the interviewer asked, how do you feel about the reception that the original Blackguards got? And this is over at RPGwatch.com. Now, Guy says that the game was based on the Dark Eye pen and paper system, which they found was actually unnecessarily complicated at times, and it caused frustration in some players. So in Blackguards 2, they're keeping that complexity, but they're making the whole character sheet and leveling system much cleaner and more simple. And it's not something that I actually mentioned just now, but the leveling system's quite good. You get these points that you can allocate into specific areas, and you can almost do that at any time. Guy also noted that the first game potentially didn't rely as much on tactics as it did on random chance, and re-emphasised that the sequel focuses more on actual strategy. He finishes with, to give players a whole bunch of options is a nice idea, and they'll get some more of them in Blackguards too, but to present this within the game in a way everyone will notice is a whole different story. So we make that a real focus in Blackguards 2. And I think it's probably alluding as well to the fact that they have a specific character with a set storyline to keep everything coherent, with story supporting the combat rather than it being the other way around.
They will lose control of Gideon the same day Great Storm will hit this island.
Then we've got Hazel Sky, which I saw on the eShop, and it looked incredible. It's a third-person platform adventure that clocks in at the hefty price of £24.99. On paper, it's incredibly interesting, with the flying city of Gideon being aspired to by any budding engineers. You are one of those, and as such, you arrive having to fix a flying machine, which will take you over to Gideon. Unfortunately though, things go a bit awry, and then they go awry a second time. They essentially keep going awry, placing you on one island from the next, fixing the next machine. And to fix them, you follow a to-do list. Essentially grab the pieces of metal, place them on here. Upgrade your stapler, which incidentally turns out to be the most awesome stapler ever. A stapler that can fire staples, nails, and even fire, it seems. And while I have a lot of time and respect for any developer, especially indie, that tries to take on a large 3D project, because they're notoriously not easy, Hazel Sky falls, and it falls hard at times. The animations are incredibly clunky, and they've gone for a very strange control scheme. Essentially, you jump with one button and then have to hold a trigger to grab on. Unfortunately, if you time it even slightly incorrectly, you'll just plummet down. Maybe they intended it to be more hands-on from the player's perspective, but even when you get used to the way it should be, it doesn't work quite right. Take for example picking things up. You hold down the RZ trigger, but even if you're squeezing that trigger like your life depends on it, sometimes the player will just put the item back on the ground. What follows is an embarrassing pick up and put down show, and then to actually use an item, you release the trigger. I mean, we can all see where this is going. Now, the same trigger mechanic is applied to the movement of items in the world, and again, as you grab things, sometimes you'll grab them and then release them. Sometimes your character will just spin round on the spot, and where it feels like there should be a weighted physics system, it doesn't quite work. Then there's the voice acting. I don't want to be horrible, but the voice acting's terrible.
Why they didn't bury them? Maybe they just want us to know how serious it is. I guess I need to go back soon.
So, are you leaving now?
I could definitely do better voice acting myself. In fact, if any developers want some voice acting done, I'll do it for free rather than having this, because it's actually, you know, when it's like painful, you're like, what are they doing? They're taking the English text and it's being read with the wrong inferences, with the wrong inflections. And I get it, it's not made by English people, I do get that, but there are options out there to try and help with this, and it spoils the immersion completely for me. One area I really liked was some of the visual storytelling. There's some areas on this island that are very cool, and there's lots of books dotted around to give more lore to the story, which again, I like the idea of the story, but through some of these books, it's a bit nonsensical. It's going for that impactful, thought-provoking style, but unfortunately, the author of this writing, they're not overly talented. I hate to say that, I'm really sorry. It just comes off as a bit forced in my opinion. So look, I really respect the developers for doing this. It's not easy. And as we'll go into now, looking at the dev team that have created this, to do what they've done with such a small team is impressive, and I look forward to what they do next. But Hidden Gem? Nah, not this one. Now, Bison from the development team, a small indie studio in Brazil, gives a little history about how essentially it was a group of them at the best university in Brazil, and they started making levels and stages for different games. They created Dante's Inferno, they made Winterfell when Game of Thrones was like hype, and just experimented really with level design. Then in around 2016 or 17, they created their first game called Blade and Bones. He says himself, it's not the best game in the world, but it was our first game, and they learned everything they needed to launch games on Steam. At the time, they're only 20 years old, and it was then that they branched out to PlayStation and Xbox. The star of the show then is probably the island itself, and Bison said it's kind of an amalgamation of a few different places in Brazil. And he also makes mention, which in fairness I totally forgot, about the radio system. So in the game, the two main protagonists, Shane that you play as, and Erin, are in communication via a radio system. And they're both kind of in the same experience in different places, talking to each other. So there we go with Hazel Sky. It doesn't quite hit the mark for me, but I am very impressed that this team were able to even create this game. If they're going to go 3D again, they really need to take their time making those core mechanics feel fluid and smooth. Last but not least then, we've got Ocean's Heart. It's clearly heavily inspired by The Legend of Zelda, but also things like Blossom Tale in more recent times. The adventure starts out on what appears to be a small island or archipelago, and your main character's sent out on an errand when something terrible happens. The rest of the game sees her trying to track down her missing loved ones. She'll do this by travelling to different islands aboard a ship, and I absolutely love the dialogue between all the characters. It's funny because people often complain about, oh, there's so many pixel art games, but when they're done right, they really can be beautiful. There's a full inventory system here. You can equip many different items. You can heal yourself with different fruits that you've picked from trees. You'll find a boomerang, a bow and arrow, a sword. And while the combat's quite straightforward, it always feels fair and responsive. Then there's the music. The game has a fantastic soundtrack, and it gets its atmosphere spot on right from the off. Where it falters a little for me is in some of the damage that you take from enemies. Sometimes you'll take one heart, you have a heart system up here, but other times you'll lose your entire bar and respawn from the start of the area. I'm not sure if it was something I was doing, but it seemed sporadic and a little bit unusual. As well as those main quest lines, there are also lots of side quests to undertake. There's a full crafting system. Here you can combine and make your own potions, and there are lots of little secrets dotted all over the place. Now, the mapping system leaves a little bit to be desired, and there are a few little quirks in that regard, but otherwise this is brilliant. There's more RPG here than some of the older Zelda games, and there are a few interesting choices of button placement. Things like your interact button I think also makes you roll, if I remember correctly, and that was a bit of a pain. But I would still say Ocean's Heart for me is a hidden gem. It's a reasonable price at £13.49, but I think if that was £9.99 it would just be the sweet spot. You're looking at around about 8 to 10 hours, which for this style of game's probably on point, and it's one where the whole thing will just put a big smile on your face. If you haven't played this, or you're a big fan of Blossom Tales or classic Zelda, it should definitely be on your hidden gems list. Now let's look at the developer. Over on GamingNexus.com, they published a developer chat with Max Mraz, who, yeah, you guessed it, he did this all on his own. After stumbling upon an engine called Solaris, an open source game engine, which was originally designed for Legend of Zelda fan projects, Mraz decided to make a game. Despite the fact he didn't know how to code, he then spent the next 4 years teaching himself how to code. He created all of the visuals you see in the game, recorded the entire soundtrack by himself, and then released it. He actually ended up releasing another game first called Yarn Town, and then went back to Ocean's Heart to finish it off. When questioned about how he created the game, he goes on to say, I did all the art and all of the music, almost all of the coding, but I did have a couple of people help me out with some stuff, but yeah, it's essentially a one-man show. The interviewer mentions the obvious Zelda inspiration, but asks what other games he was looking at the time. And interestingly, he says, The Witcher 3, not long before I started, I absolutely loved it. That was definitely a big inspiration in terms of how I wanted all the side quests to have some kind of twist. And yeah, that's something I didn't really mention. They're never run of the mill, and I think they're part of what makes the whole thing feel so unique. The interviewer then goes on to say about the number of secrets in the game, to which Max replies, that's one of my favourite things in games and in real life too. When you're just exploring around somewhere, and then you go off on some random trail, and then it just opens up into a huge unmarked thing, and you're like, whoa, what is this? And I think that says it all really with Ocean's Heart. Definitely a hidden gem in my opinion. So that's it for this episode. Let me know what you thought of it, if it was useful or interesting, and if it needs any tweaking or anything like that. I just, we like to try new ideas, and I thought hidden gem hunting, what could possibly be more fun than that? And thanks to all the developers for the review codes. If you're interested in any of the games, I'll pop a link to their respective eShops down in the description, completely unaffiliated. And also, if you want to save 10%, use code SWITCHUP over at switchup.gg to buy your eShop credit. Thanks to all of you. Hope you're having a good week. I'll probably still in Spain when you're watching this one. Viva Español for all things Switch all the time. Keep it Switch up. Cheers, guys. See ya!